told me they were tapped out. That's the exact phrase my father used, tapped out, while my 6-year-old son was lying in a hospital bed with tubes coming out of his arms and a machine breathing for him. 3 years later, I found out they'd written my sister a check for $47,000 to put a down payment on a house in Scottsdale. I want you to sit with that for a second. My son almost died. My parents said they had nothing, and then they'll quietly handed my sister enough money to buy a home in Arizona while I was still paying off the medical debt one $200 installment at a time. My son's name is Theo. He was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition called hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis, HLH, when he was 6 years old. Most people have never heard of it. I hadn't either, until the pediatric hematologist sat down across from me and my husband in a small conference room at Children's Hospital and told us that Theo's immune system had essentially turned against itself, that it was attacking his own organs, that without treatment and possibly a bone marrow transplant, there was a very real chance we would lose him. I remember my husband reaching under the table and grabbing my hand. I remember the doctor's mouth still moving. I couldn't hear anything for a few seconds, just this high, thin ringing. Theo had been sick for about 3 weeks before we knew what it was. He'd had a fever that wouldn't break, then his lymph nodes swelled, then his spleen. Our regular pediatrician ran blood work and immediately referred us to a specialist. By the time we got to Children's Hospital, he could barely keep his eyes open. The treatment plan started with chemotherapy to suppress his immune system. The hope was that chemo alone might bring him into remission. If it didn't, we'd be looking at a bone marrow transplant. The initial round of treatment, the hospital stay, the medications, the specialist fees, came to just over $38,000 in out-of-pocket costs after insurance. We had decent insurance. I want to be clear about that, because I know what people think when they hear these numbers. We both had jobs. My husband worked in logistics management, and I was a third-grade teacher. We weren't irresponsible people. We had a savings account. We had an emergency fund. We just didn't have an emergency fund for this. I called my parents 3 days after Theo was admitted. I wasn't calling to ask for money right away. I called because my son was sick and I needed to hear my mother's voice. I needed her to tell me it was going to be okay even if she didn't know that for certain. That's what I needed. She cried. My father got on the phone and said he was so sorry and that they'd pray for Theo every day. My mother asked if there was anything they could do. I told her about the costs. I told her we'd already drained our savings and we were looking at taking out a personal loan, but the interest rate was brutal and we were already stretched thin with the mortgage. I told her that if they had anything, even a loan between family, something we'd pay back, it would mean the world to us. There was a pause. My father said, "Sweetheart, we're tapped out. Between the property taxes going up and your mother's prescriptions, we just don't have anything liquid right now." I believed him. My parents lived modestly. They had a house in the same suburb where I grew up, drove older cars, clipped coupons. My father had retired 2 years earlier on a pension and Social Security. I genuinely believed him. My mother said she wished she could do more. She said, "You know, if we had it, it would already be yours." I said I understood. I thanked them for their prayers. I hung up the phone and I went back into Theo's room and I sat next to his bed and I watched him sleep and I made myself stop crying before he woke up. We took out the loan. We also set up a GoFundMe, which felt humiliating, honestly, but our friends pushed us to do it, and within 2 weeks, strangers had donated almost $12,000. People we'd never met, people who had lost children of their own, people who just saw the post and gave $20. That kindness still makes me cry when I think about it. Theo's chemo worked. Not completely, not permanently, but enough that the doctors felt cautiously hopeful. He spent 11 weeks in the hospital total, came home right before Thanksgiving, and spent the better part of that winter and spring recovering. He lost his hair. He was exhausted all the time. He couldn't go to school. I took a leave of absence to stay home with him, which cut our household income almost in half. We managed, I don't know how exactly, credit cards. The GoFundMe. Our friends brought meals every week for months. My colleague covered my classroom with so much care and kept sending me updates. We managed. My parents visited once during those 11 weeks. Once. They drove up on a Saturday, stayed for about 4 hours, brought Theo a stuffed bear, and then my father said they needed to get back before dark because he didn't like driving at night. My mother hugged me at the door and told me I was doing a great job. That was it? My sister, who lived 2 states away, called more than they did. I want to be fair. She had 2 young kids of her own and a job, and she couldn't just drop everything and come, but she called. She sent Theo a video message every week. She mailed him activity books and little games. She showed up in whatever way she could. My parents, who were 40 minutes away, showed up once. I pushed that to the back of my mind because I didn't have the bandwidth to be angry. I was surviving. Theo was surviving. That was the only thing that mattered. He turned 8 in the spring. We threw him a birthday party in the backyard, just a small one, with a few kids from the neighborhood. He wore a baseball cap over his bald head and he ran around like any other kid, and I stood at the back of the yard and cried into my own sleeve because I had not been sure 6 months earlier that we would be here, that he would be here. He's 10 now, he's in remission, he plays soccer, he's doing fine. What happened 2 years after his diagnosis is why I'm telling you any of this. My sister called me on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual because we mostly texted. I picked up and she launched immediately into something that sounded like very excited news. She and her husband had just closed on a real house, not an apartment, in a neighborhood they'd been wanting to get into for years. She was thrilled. She said it almost fell through at the last minute because they were short on the down payment, but then Mom and Dad had stepped in and helped them cover it. And she said it so casually, like I knew, like this was information I was already in possession of. I said, I'm sorry, Mom and Dad helped you with the down payment? She said, yeah, they gave us $47,000. Honestly, I don't know what we would have done without them. I remember exactly where I was standing, in my kitchen, by the window over the sink. I had a dish towel in my hand and I just stopped moving. $47,000, I said. I know, it's a lot, she said. They said they'd been saving it specifically for something like this, for the kids, and the timing just worked out. Isn't that amazing? I don't remember the rest of that conversation. I think I said congratulations. I think I said that was wonderful. I got off the phone and I stood in my kitchen for a very long time. My parents had $47,000 available, specifically saved apparently to help their children, when my son was in the hospital, when I asked them for help. When my father looked me in the eye over the phone and told me they were tapped out. They had it. They just chose not to give it to me. I want to be very precise here because this matters to me. I am not saying my sister didn't deserve their help. I'm not angry at her. She had no idea what I had been through. She had no idea they'd turned me down. As far as she knew, our parents had given her a gift, and that was a beautiful thing. What I'm saying is that my parents looked at a 6-year-old child fighting for his life and looked at their savings account and chose to save the money for something else. And then they lied to my face about it. I didn't confront them right away. I needed time to think, and honestly, I needed time to figure out if I was misremembering something. I went back through my texts from that period. I found the one where I had laid it out for my mother in writing, the costs, the loan, the desperation. I found her response, "We are praying so hard. I wish we could do more. Love you." I was not misremembering. I called my father about a week later. I kept my voice very even. I told him I'd heard about the money they'd given my sister and that I was confused because when Theo was sick and I had asked for help, he told me they didn't have anything available. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That was a different situation." I asked him what he meant by that. He said, "A house is an investment. Medical expenses are they're a loss. We didn't feel comfortable putting money into something with no return." I want you to think about what he just said. He looked at his grandson's life and called it a bad investment. I didn't scream. I don't know how. I told him I needed to go and I hung up the phone. I didn't speak to either of my parents for the better part of a year. My husband supported me completely. He was angrier than I was, honestly, which is the only time in our marriage that he has ever been the angrier one. He's a calm, steady person. He was not calm about this. My sister, once she understood the full picture, was horrified. She offered to give the money back to my parents and have them give it to me to pay down the medical debt. I told her no. It wasn't about the money anymore. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't going to pay for what they had done. My parents tried to reach out a few times over those months. My mother sent cards. My father left voicemails that started with him clearing his throat for so long, I'd skip past it just to get to the actual message. They were sorry. They hadn't meant to hurt me. They hoped I could understand their perspective. I had nothing to say to that. You don't get to explain away telling your child you were broke while you had $47,000 in the bank. There's no framing that makes that something other than what it is. The thing I struggled with most, and I want to be honest about this because it's the part that was hardest to sit with, was whether the sin was the money or the lie. Because I think I could have found some way, eventually, to accept that they'd made a choice about how to use their savings. People have the right to do that. What I couldn't process was the lie, the specific, deliberate choice to look at me while I was drowning and say, "We have nothing to throw you," when they had a life raft sitting in their account the whole time. 11 months after I stopped talking to them, my father had a major cardiac episode. He'd had some heart issues in the past, some stents placed, but this one was serious. He was in the ICU for 2 weeks. My mother called my cell phone, which I had not blocked because I was still getting the voicemails and deleting them, and she was not angry or manipulative. She was terrified. She sounded like an old woman. She said, "Your father is very sick. I don't know what's going to happen." I went to the hospital. I want to be clear that I was not going for them. I was going because my husband said that if something happened to my father and I hadn't gone, I would carry that in a way that would be hard to put down. He was right. He's usually right. My father was awake but weak. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. My mother was sitting in the chair beside his bed, and she stood up when I came in and hugged me, and she felt fragile in a way she never had before. We didn't have a reconciliation scene. There wasn't a tearful apology. My father told me he was glad I came. My mother held my hand. I stayed for 2 hours, and then I drove home. He recovered. It took a long time, but he recovered. In the weeks after his hospital stay, my parents came to me together. They sat in my living room, which was surreal, because I hadn't had them in my house in over a year, and my father talked for a long time. He said a lot of things I had needed to hear. He said specifically, and I'm going to try to get this right because it matters, when Theo was sick, we made the wrong choice. I told myself it was about protecting our retirement, about not knowing how much we'd need in the future. But that was a lie I told myself because the truth was that I was scared the money would run out and there wouldn't be enough for us. I put our comfort above your son's life. There is no excuse for that, and I don't have one. My mother cried through most of it. She said she had known it was wrong when they made the decision and had said nothing. They didn't ask for forgiveness. That surprised me. My father said, "I'm not asking you to forgive us. I'm asking you to know that we understand what we did." I did not hug them when they left. I walked them to the door and I thanked them for coming. And I closed the door and I stood in a hallway for a long time. My husband asked me how I felt. I said I didn't know yet. Here's where I am now, and I'm still figuring this out in real time. I have not rebuilt the relationship with my parents that I had before. I don't know if I will. There is something that broke in me when I understood what they had chosen, and it didn't unbreak just because they acknowledged it. I see them. Holidays, Theo's birthday, we are civil. They are wonderful with Theo, who doesn't know any of this, and I intend to keep it that way until he's old enough to understand context. My sister and I are closer now than we have ever been. That's the thing nobody tells you. Sometimes a betrayal from one direction deepens a different bond entirely. I still pay off the last of the medical debt every month. We're almost done. When we make the final payment, I am going to take Theo out for a really good dinner, just the two of us, And I'm not going to tell him why, and I'm going to watch him eat too much dessert, and I'm going to be grateful. That's all I've got. Being grateful that he's here. Being grateful for the strangers who gave $20 they didn't have to give. Being grateful for the husband who held my hand in a conference room when the world stopped making sound for a few seconds. What my parents did lives in a room in my chest that I keep mostly closed. I don't let myself think about what those 11 weeks might have been like if we hadn't been drowning financially at the same time. I don't let myself go there very often. But some days I open that door just a little and I feel it. All of it. And then I close it again and I go check on my kid. I keep coming back to one thing my father said when he sat in my living room that afternoon. He said he had told himself a story that holding on to the money was about protecting their future, about not knowing what they'd need. But then he said, that was a lie I told myself, and I think about that a lot, not because it absolved him, but because it was the most honest thing he'd ever said to me. He finally had the clarity to look at his own choices without flinching. That kind of honesty costs something. It came late, but it came. What happened to our family is a story about what people choose when they're afraid. My parents were afraid of running out, of uncertainty, of a medical system that can swallow a retirement whole. I understand that fear now more than I did when I was standing in that kitchen with a dish towel in my hand and the ground dropping out from under me. Fear doesn't excuse what they did. But understanding it is the only way I've been able to carry it without it crushing me. The people who showed up for Theo, the strangers who gave $20 on GoFundMe, my colleague who kept my classroom like it was her own, the friends who brought meals every Tuesday for months, none of them owed us anything. They acted anyway. That's not luck or coincidence. That's what happens when people decide that doing right by someone else matters more than whatever it costs them. I watched it happen in real time and it changed something in me about what I believe people are capable of. Theo doesn't know any of this. He's 10. He plays soccer. He eats too much cereal and argues about bedtime. He has no idea that strangers funded his survival or that his grandparents chose a down payment over his life or that his mother stood in a hospital hallway once and couldn't hear anything because the world had gone quiet. I'm going to protect that for as long as I can. And when he's old enough to understand the full picture, I want him to know not just what happened, but what I learned from it. That how you act when it's hard is the only version of yourself that truly counts. I've thought about whether I made the right call going to the hospital when my father had his cardiac episode. There were people in my life who said I didn't owe him that. Maybe they were right, but I know that I could not have sat at home and let that define me. The person who stayed away out of principle while someone was dying. Theo survived because other people chose to show up. I couldn't build a life on not being that for someone else, even someone who had failed me. We're almost done paying off the medical debt. A few more months. When that last payment clears, I'm taking Theo out for dinner, just the two of us. He'll order too much dessert and I won't say a word about it. That's what I'm working toward. Not the money being gone, just that dinner. Just him, sitting across from me, healthy and 10 years old and completely unaware that we made it. That's enough. That has always been enough.